Alright, well, so the first thing is wash your hands in the kitchen. Since I'm being an attorney, I want to make sure that my hands are clean. So, to start, we're going to preheat our oven, which we already have at 350 degrees. And like I mentioned before, something that we're using is a springform pan. So this is typically used more for cheesecakes, that you'll be familiar with this. It's unique in that it has this little mechanism that lets you lift the base out. Because this is a flourless cake, it can be more delicate, and so removing it out of the pan is made much easier using a springform. So, and I have a piece of parchment paper down here at the bottom. You want to prep your pan either with butter or, you know, one of those butter sprays. Parchment paper is also a great way, and you can buy pre-cut rounds or just buy a big, gigantic roll and cut them yourself. So we have that set aside. And now we're going to come over. So like I said, this is a very dense cake. It's made typically with little to no flour. Today we're not going to use any flour of the traditional sort. So if you're a gluten sufferer, this is a great recipe too. These are also very popular for anyone who is Jewish out there during Passover, because these are made quite traditionally without leavenings that would normally be forbidden. So let's get going. So like I said, we're not using normal flour. What we're using is actually ground hazelnut. This is a hazelnut meal. You can buy these prepackaged or buy your own hazelnuts and grind them up if you have a really good food processor and a little bit of patience. What you're going to need is ground hazelnut. We're going to use approximately 1.5 cups. You're going to want white granulated sugar. We're going to use about 2/3 cup. 5 eggs. We're going to separate those. Some salt. I have a lot here, but you'll only really need about 1/2 teaspoon. Some ground or fresh nutmeg. I come from the Alton Brown School of Learning, so I always have fresh whole nutmeg with me and a grater. But if you need to use ground, that's okay. We're only going to use a tiny bit. You will want 1 stick of butter, as seen here. A little extra in case you're greasing up your pan. And then this, which is some homemade apple butter that I have, but you can buy apple butter from pretty much any store. Trader Joe's definitely has them. Because what we're going to be making is a hazelnut apple tort. You'll start with your hazelnut flour. And I have these really fun measuring cups that I found that are Russian stacking balls. So I'm going to use these today. So there's our 1.5 cups of hazelnut meal. We're going to use 1/2 teaspoon of salt. Now a lot of people get frustrated. Some people don't like baking because it does require this level of attention to detail with ingredients, but it's essential. And I'll try to explain why we use some of the things we use. So like I said, a little bit of fresh nutmeg, not a lot, you know, a couple sprigs like that. If you're using ground, just a pinch. And this is where you've washed your hands, so go ahead and pinch it out. It's gonna bake, you'll be okay. So we've got our salt, our nutmeg, and our hazelnut. Then what we're going to do, and this is not necessarily a traditional way of making cakes, but we're actually going to blend the butter in with the meal first. So first, I'm just going to lightly whisk up these. Okay. So we'll just plop our butter right on in. So now what we essentially have is kind of a hazelnut buttery mess. Not to be confused with hazelnut butter. And normally at home I would have a million stand mixers and things, but I have the one, so we're going to have to wash these off very, very well, because we're going to be using them later to mix our egg whites. And for that you want to ensure that you have no fat whatsoever on the beaters. Okay, so the next step is the eggs. Now, separating the eggs is very important here. Like I said, we want clean beaters because what we're using as our leavening mode of action primarily in this recipe is the egg whites, which we're going to whip into a nice thick protein structure. But in order to do that, we have to separate the egg yolk from the egg white. So there are a couple of ways to do this. There's the old bartender trick. And once you've cracked the egg, you can kind of switch the yolk back and forth and dump it out. This requires some finesse, and depending on how your egg cracks, it can be very easy to pierce the yolk, which as you see I did here. So if you're not careful, that'll leak into your egg whites. Another trick that requires getting your hands a little bit messy, but generally results in safer yolk extraction, is to go ahead and just crack that whole yolk in your bowl, and then with your hand, very gently, you can lift up the yolk, scoop it out, and separate it. Which is why it is important that we have clean hands. Separating your eggs is a lot easier when they're cold, but your egg whites are going to whip up a lot better when they're at room temperature. So you have a couple options. If you have time, you can go ahead and take your eggs out when they're cold, separate them, leave the egg whites, come back and whip, or just do it all at room temperature, it'll be fine. My eggs are very fresh actually, so they're resisting cracking easily. Okay, there we go. Get it a little bit started. So that's about what we're looking for our egg whites. So when you whip these, you want to do it kind of gently at first. You can build up steam towards the end. And we're just trying to get as much air and structure into them as possible. You don't want to over whip. Once you start to see liquid separating out, you've gone too far. And you pretty much need to just start over. And I think that's just about pushing it. That's perfect. See how it stands up at a peak when you lift your beaters? That's a stiff peak, okay? So that is exactly where you want to be. And if you'll notice, look how much volume we've created from those egg whites from earlier. That is how our cake is going to rise. So that is done. Yay! Okay, so we've beaten our egg whites. They're set aside and ready and waiting. And our oven is already hot and ready to go. We've got our flour mixture blended up. Now we're going to do the last few steps to bring it all together. Your egg yolks are going to be used here. We've got the 4, plus the one that I broke, sitting in this bowl. And what we're going to do is whisk those with about 2/3 of a cup of sugar. Depending on how sweet your apple butter is, since that's being added in, you might want to maybe just do 1/2 cup, but we'll go ahead and err on the side of sweetness here, because I try to make my apple butter a little less than sweet. So in goes your sugar with your egg yolks. And then what you're going to do, we're going to use a hand whisk here just because it's a little less noisy, is you're going to beat this up. And you want to get your yolks nice and thick. Get that sugar really nice and dissolved. And that's beautiful. Okay. Now we're going to add in our apple butter. Now, take my word for it, this is about 1/2 cup, but that's how much you're going to want. I just know that this is the end of my apple butter from last season, so I'm going to have to make some more. And now apple butter, in case you're wondering, if you're unfamiliar with this, is not actually butter at all. It is just think of it as applesauce that's been left to bake for another few hours. It's very hyper concentrated applesauce, and it adds a lot of flavor. Sometimes there's a little bit of cinnamon in it, so it's going to give our cake a really nice flavor, and apple and hazelnut go so well together. So this will be a great cake in the fall when you're studying to bake up. Okay, so we've got our liquidy apple butter mixture. Now we're going to add in our flour base mixture. Scoop on out. Now, this may happen. Butter is a dairy product, and apple butter, which is this hyper-reduced kind of applesauce, tends to also have a little bit of vinegar in it, so it's a little acidic. So if your batter looks a little curdled which it might in a minute. Don't worry about it. That's just a normal chemical reaction. Your cake is not going to be horrible. It all evens out when it gets in the oven. Okay, so let's mix it up now. Yeah, see, and there's that curdling action. I know, it's not that appetizing, right? Don't worry about it. It'll all go away once it bakes up. Okay, great. So there's the bulk of our cake mixture. The last step is going to be to fold in those egg whites. This is where you want to be very careful and have kind of a gentle hand. So we've got this nice big bowl of egg whites. Go ahead and scoop out about 1/3 of what you've done. We're gonna go ahead and just blend that into the mixture here to lighten it so it's not quite so heavy, because this is a very dense cake, as I said, so the batter is very heavy. And we want to lighten it just a little bit with some of the egg whites, and then the rest are going to be folded in a bit more gently to give us that lift. Okay. It lightens the color too, you can see. Okay, great. So now we want to incorporate the rest of these egg whites as gently as we possibly can on the sink. Slide that on in. See, and that right there, that it's sliding tells me that I was just almost to the point of over beating my egg whites, because that means there's a little bit of moisture in there. So you just want to very delicately kind of fold them into your batter. We want them fully incorporated, otherwise you'll just end up with chunks of egg white. But you don't want to completely lose the structure either. So go ahead and take your time with this. Okay, so we've got our egg whites mostly blended in here. We're just gonna pour that into our pan. So we have our pan, which, as I said, has this parchment paper, but I really wanna make sure it doesn't stick, so we're gonna go ahead and add a little bit of butter too. So that never hurt anybody. So maybe Paula Deen, but I think other things hurt her career more than the butter did. So let's keep moving. Now, you can have extra butter out here, but something that I've forgot in planning for this actually is that lots of times when you remove the butter from your package, there's just this perfect amount here that makes a great job of buttering your pan. Okay, and it's perfect. It usually gets you just the right amount. That's my little trick. We're gonna butter the bottom too, just to help the parchment paper stick along the outsides. Okay, so just stir it up a little bit more to make sure that those last little bits of egg white are fully, incorporated but not lost, and then we will pour on into our pan. And because this is such a rich and dense cake, I don't normally serve this frosted. When it comes out, something you can do if you want to dress it up a little bit is just sprinkle a little bit of powdered sugar on top to make it a little bit prettier. And then we pop it into the oven. Oh, I should check. And this is why you always check inside your oven first. Some people keep pans inside their ovens. If you're in New York and you happen to know someone like Carrie Bradshaw, you might have ruined a pair of really expensive Napoleonics at this point. So always check your oven first. Don't do what I did. And then pop that in there. We're going to let that bake for about 30 to 40 minutes. It'll get nice and brown and really dark on top, but the inside's going to stay nice and dense and delicious. And come back and check up on it.
So we're back, as you can see from the kitchen adventures. Now, while everything's baking, we've talked about the dessert tort, but let's talk about legal torts.
Okay.
So, for those who have not gone to law school and do not know the wonder of a torts professor, we don't learn baking.
Oh,
It's not like we have Olivia teaching us how to cook something.
shoot.
It is a bummer. I still have nightmares about torts.
Really, that bad?
The professor was a little wacky. We didn't know negligence had elements until 2 weeks before the final.
Okay.
There are 5 elements to negligence. It's a good thing to know, so if anyone's experiencing that, look it up. But you do have, I did very well in remedies. So
Okay.
I had an A in remedies, which was, basically redoing contracts and torts.
So what is a tort?
A tort is a civil wrong other than a breach of contract for which you can get a remedy.
Okay.
And so negligence is a tort. You get hit by a car, that's a tort. If you have some, if I smacked you upside the head, it's a criminal offense, but it's a tort that you could get to as well.
So anytime someone says, well, let's sue them, basically you're talking about a tort.
Yes.
Okay.
Causes of action in civil court are usually in breach of contract or a tort.
Okay.
And so they're not as tasty, but they come in many flavors. And there are many issues from joint and several liability to assumption of risk, which I talked about with red shirts and Star Trek. And so when you look at geek things in the examples that you have, Firefly has many references for contract law.
Right.
Yes. And this is what happens when lawyers watch TV and movies. This is how we see the world.
You see the world through your profession.
Yeah, and sometimes it's skewed.
That's okay. I see the world quite often through my profession and hobbies, of which there are many.
Now, since you are a real scientist, how do you see the world?
And it depends on the situation. Lots of times I will see the world through kind of a lens of cancer research and clinical trials, which can be very depressing. I also, since the food is such a hobby of mine, I will definitely look at things a lot of the time and think, how can I write a recipe about this? Because it's a lot of fun to find that kind of inspiration.
Are you using the scientific method on a daily basis?
Oh gosh. You mean the whole traditional hypothesis, testing out, and conclusion step?
Entertain me, yes.
I think, maybe I definitely look at things from kind of a scientific point of view. I'm constantly thinking, how can we test this? How can we study? I'm a big yoga aficionado, and I definitely I have several designs in my head for interesting studies that could be done on the health effects of yoga.
I think of yoga, and I think of screaming in agony and signing a confession to a war crime I did not commit. That's
Oh, it's not that bad.
it scares me.
But definitely with food too, and when you were talking about your blog and we were conversing, and I was thinking about food and cooking and how can we tie this all together, and something I'm really passionate about because I'm in science and healthcare and also love food is how food affects your health. And how important it is to know what we eat. And I think there was just a case decided by the Naked Juice Company, which is owned, actually, I did not know this, by Pepsi.
Yeah, it was a settlement. So, and it's ironic in the Northern District of California where we live in federal court, there have been a whole bunch of recent lawsuits dealing with food labeling. And so there are federal rules that trump state law because the state law has to mirror what the feds do.
Okay.
And so that's how some of those causes of action, if sued in state court, get dismissed because they can't trump federal law. And something I didn't know, I'm an e-discovery guy. I didn't know there was an entire food labeling practice area, and it's huge. But Naked Juice, there was a settlement. So PepsiCo denied any wrongdoings, but it dealt with labeling of juice, and you can get up to $75 if you can prove that you purchased one of the juices from like late 2007. You can look on their website
Right.
for exactly. I think proving that you purchased one during that time period might be a challenge.
I think they said if you have the receipt, you can get up to something like $75, and even if you don't, you can still try and claim and get, I don't know, like $25 back.
Yeah, it raises the interesting concept of, in a class action, standing that you purchased something in 2008, because did you save that bottle?
Right.
Did you save that receipt from 2008 when you stopped at a convenience store or picked up a juice on the way to work?
Probably not.
Yeah, that would create an interesting standing challenge.
But, so I think the issue in that case was that these are labeled as all natural, and in actuality, a lot of these terms that get used on foods, things like natural, things like organic, they actually have some wiggle room. Foods that are organic, or there are foods that contain organic ingredients, are very different from one another. All natural isn't actually regulated at all, I believe, from the last time I read about it. And I think in this case there was some concern over some of the ingredients being genetically modified too.
Exactly.
Which is why I think there are a lot of cases now. People are aware that there's genetically modified food and they're concerned about that.
In one of the cases that I read, the judge, who was based in San Jose, actually noted in the opening of the opinion that this was one of many cases that had been filed dealing with food labeling.
So if you think of, let's say, a giant Lego structure of a piece of corn, all right, that is the final product of the corn. Now, it all comes back to DNA. All living things have DNA, right? DNA is kind of like the blueprint for making that corn structure. DNA translates into smaller subunits called amino acids, which we need. Those make proteins, and those proteins can kind of be like each individual Lego building block, right? Our bodies are constructed of a bunch of things, but the DNA translates into these proteins, and they are part of creating the structure. When you take that one Lego piece out, you're not seeing the corn, you're just seeing that individual protein. That's a lot of what happens with genetic modification of foods. You're finding a specific DNA sequence responsible for making a specific protein that you want to have expressed and having that happen in your food. So, yes, the apple may contain a genetic sequence from scorpion, but you're not eating a scorpion. You're eating that protein. And I don't know if actually there are apples that contain scorpion. I don't know where that example came from, but it's one I always think of.
Freudian analysis probably would reveal wonders about that.
Right. So the concern that is valid, that does, I do think, warrant some labeling of foods, is more specifically about where that protein came from. When your body has an allergic reaction to something, it's reacting to a protein structure. So if you were to say take a protein that's expressed in Brazil nuts and splice it into your tomato, someone who has a Brazil nut allergy won't know that it's in that tomato, and they might have a potential problem. Thankfully, we tend to stay away from known allergens when you do this. There's a lot of rigorous laboratory testing to find out if a protein is likely to be an allergen. But I do think that, from the interest and the viewpoint of you should know what's going in your body, we need to have some idea of where these proteins are coming from. The problem is most people see genetic modification, freak out, and think they're going to turn into Spider-Man. And that's not the case.
No. That's
Unfortunately. I would eat 5 radioactive spiders right now if it meant I could have superpowers.
Okay then. Well, that's that does bring us back to assumption of risk, and those spiders better have a warning label on them.
Yep, that's true.
And PETA might get angry as well if you ate a spider, especially on camera. So there's that. So, well, with that, we've now covered torts and genetic modification of food and food labeling.
And again, I'm not an expert, and there are definitely valid reasons to be concerned about genetically modified foods. I just think that, part of understanding and being able to make an informed decision about whether or not you want to eat them is really understanding what's going on.
Exactly. And now, let's go check on the tort.
Okay, so our cake has been in there for about, I think, how much did we set them? 35 minutes or so. So we're gonna take a little peek. Unfortunately, my spring form is leaky, so we had to put a pan underneath to catch a few drips of batter that come out. So that's a good lesson to learn too. And as you can see here, I pull this out. cake is nice and brown on top. It has risen. It's not even, and that's okay because when you take it out, most of this is gonna fall down towards the center anyway. And it looks like it's still a little wobbly there in the center. You might want to leave it for about another 10 minutes or so. Here we have our finished cake. It's looking pretty good to me. I think it's about through. This is where a toothpick test can come in handy. But now what you're going to need to do, and see how it's kind of pulling away from the sides just slightly on the edges there. That's a good sign that it's cooked through. Do either a very, very ginger test with a knife or a toothpick. And you just want to make sure that when you slice through the center, very delicately. See how it came out pretty clean? There's no batter sticking to it. That's a good sign. So now you need to let this cake cool fully before you cut into it. And what's going to happen is it might sink a little in the center because again we used only egg whites as a leavener. It's going to be mostly a very dense cake. That's okay. It's good, it's delicious. Don't worry about it. This is not a high fancy 3-tiered cake. This is a torte. And they're not always pretty, but they are wonderful. So we're just going to let that sit down and cool and come back to it. Okay, so if your cake is cooled enough, probably going to give it about an hour or two. And come over, and like I said, this is a springform pan, so it has this fun clasp that we unhinge. Okay, and your cake just kind of pushes up through the bottom. Whee! Get a little creative. And so it looks like a little bit of it stuck to the sides. That's okay. Like I said, this is not meant to be the prettiest cake, but it is going to be absolutely delicious. So we've unset it from our pan. So we've got our cake. Now the easiest way that I found to putting your cake out on display is actually going to take two plates. Cover the cake with your first plate and flip it over. This is a sturdy enough cake to do this with. And so when you do that, that lets you come to the bottom and very gently. And my cake is still a little warm here, so it's going to stick a little bit more. If you fully let it cool, it should peel away nicely. And if you used parchment paper, the pan is going to just lift off there. Okay, great. Set that aside. And then here's our parchment paper, which you can see is nice and gooey. And like I said, again, my cake is still a little warm. If you want this to be a bit easier, really let it come fully cool. Okay. Off comes the parchment paper, and then we take our second plate. Over. I don't think this is centered quite right, but that's okay. And there you go. Your cake is now on your plate, and that's how you get a cake on a plate without breaking it at all. Okay? And these plates have a little bit of a filter, so you're going to see that this really sinks down in the center now. If you want it to be nice and pretty and flat, use a flat plate. But honestly, we're just going to eat this. Who cares?